Gary Patterson says he's coming back to TCU, and he didn't build this program to watch it fall.
You are Locked On Horned Frogs, your daily podcast on the TCU Horned Frogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
That's right. Locked On Horned Frogs, your team every day. Subscribe to the YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. I'm your host, Steven Simcox. I've been covering TCU athletics for the past 12 seasons. So Matt Mosley had Gary Patterson on his radio show on Friday. And I used to have the privilege of working with Matt Mosley as his producer on that radio program. And so I texted him on Friday and I said, hey, could you ask Gary a question for me? Could you ask him, would he ever consider coming back to TCU in some sort of role? And at the end of that interview, Matt said, hey, last thing for you. TCU has a new athletic director now, Mike Buddy, who came up from Army. Have you met him? Would you consider coming back in some sort of form or fashion? He didn't address the first part. I don't know if he knows Mike Buddy or not, but he said quickly at the start of that answer, I'll end up back at TCU. That was a quote. He also went on to say, I didn't build it for it to fall. I'll end up dying in Fort Worth. And he was talking about how Fort Worth has become their home. It's been their home forever. And he said at the end of the answer, he was like, no matter where I go to help out, that's somewhere that I'm going to come back to. So I don't know how you guys feel about this. I'd love to hear from you here in the YouTube comments, or you can tweet at me at SimcoxSteven. I know there's some hard feelings from people because Gary left and went to Texas and he went to Baylor. And I know he did those things because he still felt like he had something left in the tank. He kept going back and forth within this interview, by the way. He would say, oh, I love that I just get to play golf and I don't have to deal with everything going on right now. I don't have to deal with the transfer portal. I don't have to deal with NIL, players getting paid. I just get to do my thing. But he also said multiple times that he has all this energy. And at his age, he thinks he's got all this knowledge, he's got all this energy, and so he feels like he's still useful. He feels like there's still something left for him to do. So I think it's the perfect time to bring him back, not in a coaching role. I don't feel like that's a great idea for a number of reasons. It's not because I don't think Gary could be helpful on the defensive side of the ball, but, you know, Sonny is the guy that took over after he left. I wouldn't say there's hard feelings there, but I don't know what the vibe is. I don't think Sonny would be thrilled at that thought process necessarily. Andy Avalos is your defense coordinator now. He runs a different scheme. He still runs a hybrid scheme. He's got guys that he's trying to get in one-on-one matchups and win, but it's different than what Gary did. But how about this? Gary Patterson knows TCU donors probably better than anybody. He's got a great relationship with them. From what I've heard, there are still TCU donors that are not happy about how that era ended. And because of that, they've sort of disengaged to a certain extent. So you have a new athletic director who has done a great job wherever he's been fundraising. But he's got new clientele now. He's trying to get to know them. Who better to bring in a role, advisory, fundraising, whatever you want to call it, to drum up money and to just try to unite everybody and say, you know what? What happened was rough. It's not the way I wanted it to end. But this is home for me. I built this thing. And by the way, I listened to this, and I don't think the context of this was him taking a shot at Sonny. I don't really feel like that was the vibe. I think it was just like, hey, I put a lot of work into this. There's a lot of sweat equity in this program that's mine. And I don't want to see it dwindle, right? Like, I don't want all that to go to waste in a way by watching it become something else. I don't feel like it had anything to do with this particular coaching staff. But sign him up to help fundraise, to be an ambassador for TCU. You love playing golf? Great. Go do it with people that can move the needle and make a difference on campus, whether that's in NIL, the revenue sharing world, or facilities upgrades, whatever it is. Glad hand with those people. Tell those old war stories. Reminisce about the glory days. And just do it with a purpose. Help bring everybody together and get everyone on the same page. And you can still do things with your foundation. I mean, in theory, I guess you could still probably do some advising. He talked about how he's helped other places than Texas and Baylor. He mentioned Missouri State as one of those. You could give them the option, hey, and you could make some stipulations like, listen, we don't want you doing anything in the Big 12, but if somebody in the ACC calls you up and they just want your opinion on a few things, go for it. If somebody during the offseason wants you to fly up for a weekend and sit around and talk ball, do it. If one day you get a phone call and you suddenly decide, you know what, I got something left in the tank, I want to go coach a G5 school or whatever it is, that's available to you. But right now, let's get the boat rowing in the same direction and drum up some business for TCU athletics, specifically the football program. He said specifically, I'll end up at TCU. And some of you might sit there and say, well, he went to Texas. He went to Baylor. And I did an episode when he went to Baylor where I was upset, man. Because, okay, I get it. You want to coach. You still feel like you have something in the tank. It's probably somewhat personal for you to this day with what happened, with everything that you did there. But it just felt like it was a, hey, I'm going to show you guys. I'll go down the road to your two biggest rivals and help them out. Now, in retrospect, I understand now, and I feel like the hiring of Paul Gonzalez cements us even more. And Gary said when he was talking to Matt, he was like, listen, that was somebody that I told Dave, like when I was there, I was like, hey, if he ever came available, that would be a great pickup. He'd be one of my first choices to coach DBs. But Dave Aranda just has a ton of respect for this guy. When he got let go and they played Baylor that week, Dave spent time in his press conference saying, man, I used to have these VHS tapes of him talking at coaching school, and I would just hang on every word because I thought so much of what he was doing and how he was innovative and how he was doing, all these different things with these hybrid defenders and coming from all these different angles. So much so that when he was available, he said, hey, I need you to come in here. And Gary, before the season started, said, you know what? I think I've done all my work, because I don't believe he wants to work 70-hour weeks again, right? He did that forever. Maybe one day, but probably not right now. Well, we got the perfect role for you. You can do all the things you're doing. You can still invest in Fort Worth, which has now become your home. And you can also help in an indirect way in something that you love, which is getting guys to the NFL, creating them into great young men, giving them all the opportunities while they're at TCU to be successful. And yes, the history is a little complicated, but in that interview, he talked about how there's a lot of transition happening at TCU, and, Daniel Pullen's taking over as president. He talked about how Chancellor Boschini did a really good job, which I didn't feel like those guys were on the best terms, but he wasn't asked specifically about it. He just kind of volunteered that opinion, that take. So obviously he still has some respect for the people that were in charge there. And he knows these people that can help, whether it's NIL, revenue sharing, facility upgrades. He has good relationships with them. And I don't even really, Sonny would probably need to give some sort of blessing, but in this specific role, I don't even know if he would. Because honestly, it's not going to be like he's in the facility all the time. Things did not end the way we wanted them to. You know what? In sports, they rarely do. They rarely do. Not everybody gets to ride off in the sunset, on the shoulders of their players. A lot of times guys are kind of forced out. Now, maybe it's not as ugly as it was here where it was mid-season, but there's plenty of examples of coaches that after a lackluster season and maybe a win in a bowl game, they had to retire, but they weren't necessarily ready to retire. It was everybody looking at the situation and saying, it's time to move on. But Gary meant so much to the university. Everybody jokes about the statue, but sure, there's a statue of him there. And he's right. He had a huge hand in building this thing. And I'm sure he doesn't want to see it fall. And I don't think he was saying like it was, but he was just specifying, you know what? I'll put a lot of work. My family, we put a lot of work into that. So make the call, Mike, buddy. I think it's time. When we come back, TCU has added to their 2026 class with an exciting pass rusher. We'll talk about that next. You're on Locked On Horned Frogs, your team every day. The NFL playoffs are here. Just before I got on here and I was recording, I got to watch that great Bills-Ravens game. Man, poor Mark Andrews. I'm really disappointed about an all NFC East, NFC Championship game because the Cowboys are not involved, but the Commanders and the Eagles are. It's playoff time. There's no better way to get in on the action with Prizepicks. Here's how it works. You simply put more or less on the right, at least two players. And if your picks hit, you could win up to 1,000 times your cash. That's right, 1,000 times your money just by making a few simple picks. Ready to run your game this football season? Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 just for playing. Don't wait. Take your game to the next level with Prizepicks. Prizepicks, run your game. We're already talking about the 2026 class, folks. Yes, that's right. TCU has now 2 commits for that 2026 class. If you didn't know, the Frogs got a commitment from Brock Boyd, wide receiver from South Lake Carroll, 3-star prospect. Technically, they have 3. Will Terry, long snapper from Iowa Colony, is also committed. But on Sunday, TCU's having their big junior weekend. A lot of big-time prospects on campus visiting. And Arlington Martin defensive end Jesse Ford committed to the Frogs. 4-star talent according to 247 Sports. 6'4", 235 pounds. Very impressive offer list. Arkansas, Baylor, Kansas State, Nebraska, Oklahoma State, Ole Miss, Texas A&M, Texas. So the 2 big flagship programs in the state, a number of SEC schools, and the Frogs get him to stay close to home by getting him committed. Now, a long way to go to the finish line. Got to make sure you keep him locked in, but a big step forward in getting him at least committed to the program right now. I remember a couple of years ago. So I get to do high school football. I get to broadcast Temple football during the season. And Temple went up to the Rangers' old stadium, and they played Arlington Martin. And then they lost. And I'm not going to pretend like I had a full scouting report on Jesse Ford that night because I didn't really know who he was going into the game. But I remember number 15 at defensive end having a couple sacks, a couple tackles for loss, and just really dominating the Temple offensive line. Had a strip sack during that ball game. And you watch the film, and he is in the backfield a lot. Really good at the point of contact, like getting off the ball, getting his hands into the defensive lineman, and throwing them back. Good size at 6'2", 235. And Andy Avalos, since he has been on campus, has done a fantastic job of prioritizing edge rushers, people who can get after the quarterback. Chad Woodfork is the big prize from this past class, and he looks like a dude who could step in and be an edge rusher for TCU right now, day one. I'm also super intrigued by Keelan Abrams. I don't know if it's going to work out. I know he's kind of undersized and wasn't the highest rated guy, but he put up incredible numbers in production as a rush end outside linebacker type in the best district in Texas high school football at DeSoto. I mean, he was all over the place and just found ways to make plays. So those types of big-time D linemen, outside linebacker, stud linebackers, as they call it in the Andy Avalos defense, have been made a priority by this new coaching staff. Ford is more of your prototypical hand-in-the-ground defensive end. They would also slide him inside at times which is cool to see. So he's got a little bit of position flex, but at 235, I mean, he'll put on weight when he gets to TCU and he does have a good frame. That's not somebody who's going to be playing a one or a three technique over a guard really at all, though. I mean, that's somebody who's going to be on the edge using their athleticism and strength and speed to try to make plays. Gabe Brooks from 247 Sports described Ford as a good-sized frontline defender with enough frame and space to have some scheme versatility, flashes point of attack power, makes a lot of effort plays, in addition to owning good physical tools. Has above average arm length and uses his extension to his advantage as a rusher and a run defender. He talks about the effort, and that does stand out when you watch his highlights. I mean, there were a number of plays. I mean, with defensive ends, you expect to see good get off, that ability to get to the outside and then sort of bend your body around the corner and make it tough on that offensive lineman to get his hands on you and also to move his feet laterally quickly enough to get the leverage and get to the edge. But you also saw him chasing down ball carriers in the run game, 5, 6, 10 yards down the field, where maybe you get beat at the point of attack or they're running a different direction than you're coming from, and you have to regroup, retrace your steps, and chase those players down. He did that on that strip sack I was talking about in the Temple game earlier. I mean, he chased the QB from one side of the field to the other and made something happen. So, big-time player. And if this TCU defense is going to live up to their potential, at Oregon, when Andy Avalos had, elite defenses or close to it, it was about pass rushers winning one-on-one matchups. Thibodeau, who is now with the Giants. And I mean, I get it. He's an NFL player, but they would isolate him. They'd find ways to get him matched up on the edge one-on-one, and he would win those battles. And he was just constantly creating pressure on the quarterback. And that made a huge difference. So that's a big part of it. Jesse Ford, Chad Woodfork, Paulo Lawale, if he's healthy this year, those have to be the guys that can do it. Travis Jackson, who showed some really good signs and ended up having to play a lot because of injuries, right? On the interior, dudes like Marcus Deal. Kelton Mickle, the JUCO transfer from Jones College in Mississippi. You need players that can win those one-on-one matchups, make things happen off the edge, and that are just able to get pressure, get sacks. There's a lot of ways to play defense, but there's really no way to blow up a play faster than to be in the backfield and to put pressure on a QB. It throws such a wrench in what teams want to do in the passing game, even with all the quick game stuff that's out there now. It's still just such a great way to immediately shut down a play and give yourself a chance to make something happen. And you see that ability with Jesse Ford at the high school level. Arlington Martin, really good program. He'll have a chance to put together a great senior season. This is a good pickup. So now you got two guys. You got a wide receiver, a defensive lineman. TCU's gone heavy in the trenches. And to me, that's the difference. If somebody's going to take over the Big 12, when we talk about that, what does that mean? You have to recruit at a high level, both in the portal and in the high school ranks. And it's one thing to land highly rated skill players. That's awesome. You need those guys. But in the state of Texas, especially, with all the spread offenses and all the teams that have so many weapons at receiver, it's not difficult to find those types of talents. It's more difficult to evaluate and find guys who project as great, blockers in the run and pass game on offense and dudes who can just blow up plays on the defensive side of the ball. And so if TCU can start doing that, and they're trying to do that, I think they've taken, on the O-line side, they've taken a lot of guys with more upside recently. But if they're really going to make their mark in this conference, that's how you have to do it, because that's the big difference between what the Big 12, the product the Big 12 is putting out there week after week, and then, what the SEC and the Big 10 have been able to do through the years. And when you watch Notre Dame and Ohio State tonight, yes, you're going to see great skill talent, but you're also going to see offensive and defensive linemen that can just dominate a ball game. And that's in a lot of ways what TCU has been missing over the last few years. They're trying to make an effort to fix that with guys like Jesse Ford, newest 2026 commit. When we come back, TCU men's basketball. How about it, man? They get a huge victory on Sunday afternoon. We'll talk about that next year on Locked On Horned Frogs, your team every day. FanDuel, one of our longtime loyal sponsors. Right now, customers can bet $5 and get $300 on bonus bets. If you win that first bet, that's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate. They have a variety of bets that keeps every game exciting. FanDuel has you covered. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Brendan Wenzel hits a three with 5 seconds left in TCU men's basketball. They upset Baylor, who's ranked 25th in the country going into today's game. I'm sure they'll fall out of the polls with a 2-loss week. They lost to Arizona earlier this week. Bottom line is Frogs win 74-71. They're now 3-3 in conference play, and just an incredible bounce back after that embarrassing loss to Utah. I don't want every TCU basketball discussion to devolve into the future of Jamie Dixon. But I'll say this. I understand all the frustration. I get it. I've been vocal about it. They have inexcusable losses like that Utah game. It's too frequent of a thing. But, in some ways, even more so than making the tournament consistently, which they've done over the last few years. Jamie is good for 2 or 3 of these games a year where they just pull off an upset that they probably shouldn't. Now, this Baylor team is talented. I don't think they're nearly as good as they've been in the past, but they're talented. And TCU really had no business winning this ball game. And they almost blew it. They had a 6-point lead with a minute left. Had a foul on a 3-pointer. And then an inbounds play where they probably should have blown the whistle. Baylor player just ran right into Brendan Wenzel. But the ball went off him. They called, they say it's Baylor ball. Jaden Nunn comes off 2 screens. Hits a 3. It's suddenly a tie ball game. But Noah Reynolds, once again, it wasn't getting a bucket this time, but just so clutch. He had the game winner against K-State, game winner against BYU. And this ball game today, it wasn't a game winner, but he breaks down the defense, makes a great decision, great pass to Wenzel, who's able to just catch and shoot from the corner, knock it down, and Baylor gets out of Waco and gets a win. Jamie Dixon, 3 wins in a row in Waco. He's 2-0 in Foster Pavilion, their new stadium. Watching this ball game, I remember after the first media timeout, like 4 minutes in, I was immediately like, okay, this is a response game for TCU. Like, they played with incredible effort. And I didn't know what it was going to end up like, but I noticed, like, this team is playing with great effort early in this ball game. Some of the rotations were slow defensively, but they were doing a really good job of cutting people off. Ernest Uday was fantastic today. Wenzel led the team with 17 points, but Ernest had 16. He was 5-9 from the field. He had 15 boards. He shot free throws well today. I don't know how many blocks he had, but I know it was multiple. Jace Posey gave them good minutes. He had a couple and one baskets where he put the ball on the deck and got to the rim. He had a huge putback late in the ball game on a rebound. They out-rebounded Baylor. They just wanted this ball game more. They played with great effort. And every time it felt like Baylor was going to push it, like they had a 12-point lead in the first half. They had leads of 7, 9, 11 in the second half. And every time I was like, all right, here we go. TCU's about to get behind by a big margin and this will be over. The Frogs came up with a big bucket. It wasn't Noah Reynolds' best game. In fact, in the first half, I jotted down a note. I was like, he's just non-existent in this ball game. He was 4-10 from the field, but man, he makes plays. There were 2 buckets in that game that I remember where Baylor was on a run. One of them in the second half, they're up 7. Crowd's starting to get into it. And it was another one of those moments where it's like, okay, this is do or die. Like, if you don't start cutting into this lead, it's going to be over. And Noah caught the ball, dribbles with his left hand, hit a spin move, got to the bucket, laid it in. And in the moment, it didn't feel like massive because it just cut it to I think cut it to a 7-point game with a 9-point lead. But those types of buckets, they had multiple times in the ball game where it's like, all right, Baylor's going to pull away. No, TCU goes on a 4-0 spurt. You get a turnover. They just hung around, and then late in that ball game, they hit some tough shots. Jamie went with the lineup. They had cut the lead to 2, and he threw, and I get why he was doing it. It was near a media timeout, and he was trying to sneak in some rest for the starters. But he put Diallo out there. He put Punch out there, and he had Alette and Wenzel, and I think Micah Robinson. And I'm sitting there like, who is going to score out of these 5? And Wenzel hit a tough turnaround jumper. Alette hit a tough jumper. You know, Deshaun, I get it. He frustrates people. He turns the ball over. He gets reckless with the ball. He goes into the paint out of control sometimes. But, man, he also makes some great individual plays. He had a huge step back 3 right before halftime that cut that lead to 7. He just finds a way. Now, this team still has a lot of limitations. And I think they played with great effort and intensity tonight. They didn't really necessarily change my opinion of what their ceiling is, but what an awesome win. On the road, finding a way. It was cool to see. Credit to them for going and doing it after just a really tough loss in the middle of the week. They'll play Kansas this week at home. So get to Shaw-Meyer Arena and make it a good environment. It's Locked On Horned Frogs, your team every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts.